to strengthen democracy to
Hello and welcome. You're watching the newsroom on NewsX World. In this show, we're going to give you a wrap up of all the top news stories that took place this day. But as always, we're going to begin with some breaking news that's now coming in. This is now news from South Asia, where in India, the government has put in force GRAP 4. The Delhi NCR government has implemented Graded Response Action Plan 4, which is the highest measure that has been enforced. Now, the Commission for Air Quality Management has reimposed GRAP 4 in Delhi NCR after the region's air quality deteriorated in the severe category. This comes just a day after GRAP 3 was enforced as a precautionary measure. The region, remember viewers, has been struggling with high pollution levels for several months, and under GRAP 4, some of the measures that will be implemented include private vehicle movement restriction. It's not completely banned, but restrictions based on emission norms and fuel types will be put in place. Vehicles meeting prescribed standards can operate, however, while older vehicles face these curves. BS3 petrol and BS4 diesel vehicles are prohibited except for those providing essential services. This coming in as the pollution crisis in India's capital Delhi worsens, and in the national capital region, the government has enforced Graded Response Action Plan Stage 4, which is the highest level, as the pollution now enters the severe category. Alright, and with that, we're now going to proceed to cover news from Iran, which has been seeing days of protest. But in the latest, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has now said that US-linked actors and Israel-linked actors are behind the killing of protesters in the anti-Khamenei protests. Khamenei says that US-Israel links were behind thousands killed in the protests, and this link was made by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In fact, to quote him, he said, "Those linked to Israel and US caused massive damages and killed several thousands during the protests." He also accused two nations of direct involvement in the violence and described Donald Trump as a criminal. As per Iranian state media, Khamenei said that the latest anti-Iran sedition was different in the US, different than what the US president personally became involved in. Iranian authorities have increasingly pointed the finger at foreign powers for the unrest and have accused long-standing geopolitical rivals, mainly the US and Israel, of fomenting instability and directing operations on the ground. In fact, we are learning that more than 3,000 people could have been killed in these protests, but the voices that are coming from ground are demanding liberation more than a regime change. As of now, as far as the internet blackout was concerned, the situation is improving as Starlink internet was made available to many people protesting in Iran. Khamenei has in fact alleged a deeper level of US involvement than in the past, and let's remind you, this came just a few hours after Donald Trump thanked Iran for stopping the executions and bringing the situation back to some level of normalcy. What stood out, however, was the scale of the alleged death toll. We are getting different reports from different rights groups based in the US and Iran, but most are saying that at least 3,000 people have been killed in these protests. In fact, talking about Khamenei's claims, it's the first time that the country's top authority has spoken of casualties in the thousands. Let's remind you that he did say that thousands killed were linked to the US or Israel linked actors as far as the anti-Khamenei protests in Iran are concerned. All right, and with that, we are now going to move to cover news from Greenland. All right, before we move to that, there are some statements that are also coming in from Iran. Let's hear it.
البته وضع اقتصادی وضع خوبی نیست. معیشت مردم حقیقتا مشکل داره. بنده میدونم این رو. باید اونا هم در این زمینه ها بایستی 2 برابر کار کنن. برای کارهای اساسی، برای نهادهای دامی، برای ارزاق لازم، برای نیازهای عمومی مردم، مسئولین دولتی باید 2 برابر همیشه کار کنن. با جدیت بیشتری باید کار کنن. در این تردید نیست. اولا ماهیت فتنه این یک فتنه آمریکایی بود، واضح بود. آمریکایی ها برنامه‌ریزی کردن، فعالیت کردن. هدف آمریکا هم اینو من قاطع سریع با تجربه 40 و چند ساله در جمهوری اسلامی عرض میکنم. هدف آمریکا بلعیدن ایرانه، یعنی ایران رو باز تحت سلطه نظامی خودشون، تحت سلطه سیاسی خودشون، تحت سلطه اقتصادی خودشون قرار بدن. هدف این.
All right, viewers, those were the statements that were issued by Khamenei where he makes that big allegation. And with that, we're now going to proceed to cover news on Greenland, which is now seeing protests. And protests over Trump's alleged acquisition bid of the Arctic territory has now spread to other countries in Europe. Protests were staged in Denmark and also in Germany. Thousands joined anti-Trump hands off Greenland protest in Denmark as well. In fact, this came after Trump threatened tariffs on countries opposing his Greenland plans and coincided with the US congressional delegation's visit to Copenhagen. Thousands of people have taken to the streets of Denmark's capital to protest Trump's push to take over Greenland, which is, as of now, an autonomous territory of Denmark. This, in fact, also came after Trump had warned on Friday that he may put a tariff on countries that oppose his plans to take over Greenland, which is now rich in minerals. They also coincided with this Copenhagen delegation that was of a bipartisan delegation from the US Congress that went to Copenhagen, which made clear that the opposition of many Americans to the Trump administration remains intact. Thousands of people have already said that they would take part in marches and rallies organized by Greenlandic associations in Copenhagen and in Aarhus, Aalborg, Odense, and the Greenlandic capital of Nuuk. And as per an association of Greenlanders in Denmark, it said that the aim is to send a clear and unified message of respect for Greenland's democracy and fundamental human rights. The Copenhagen rally, which began today, was due to make a stop outside the US Embassy in Denmark. In fact, joining me now in this discussion is my colleague Adarsh Tripathi. Adarsh, what's the latest that you're picking up? Of course, there have been many anti-Trump statements that have come in as far as his acquisition plan for Greenland is concerned. Do you think the plan as he had thought of may not be executed?
Well, Kriti, that's exactly what it looks like at the moment, because there's some serious opposition that's rising up against Trump's potential bid to take over Greenland. You've mentioned very briefly the different protests that are breaking out across Europe. Now, what we're hearing right now is that there's a massive procession that's been taken out in Nuuk, that's the capital of Greenland, and this comes alongside protests which are being labeled as hands-off Greenland protests, particularly stemming from Copenhagen, where you correctly told us that this procession started from City Hall and is marching on the way to the US Embassy at the moment. Protesters, while we don't really have an exact estimate, an exact confirmed estimate of the number of protesters which are which have joined into these demonstrations, the videos that you can see on your screens, they show protesters in their thousands in Copenhagen, across Europe, in Greenland itself, in fact, and sources are telling us that these protests are going to continue all through today, may even spill over into tomorrow. Now, when we're talking about opposition to President Trump's plan, surprisingly, a lot of opposition has come through from members of his own Republican Party. Now, it's rare that Republicans come out against their own president, but in this case, we have, for example, this bipartisan congressional delegation that's visited Greenland and spoken out in favor of Greenland remaining an autonomous region within the government, under the government of Denmark. Now, you also spoke about Trump's threat to impose tariffs on countries that do not support his Greenland takeover plans, and this particularly is important because the bipartisan delegation has reaffirmed its support for Greenland remaining a territory of Denmark. So this could be seen as a unilateral move that Trump is trying to push through with no real support in the US Congress, and naturally there's a lot of anger among the people over Trump's statements, and there's a lot of anger among the people over Trump's claims that Greenland, because it's strategic, and you should also remember that Greenland alongside Denmark is part of NATO. So a defense of Greenland shouldn't be outside the US's ambit. However, Trump continues to push on with his agenda, and well, this controversy is yet to just spiral further.
Adarsh, to give us more details about some of the key points that were made in the statements that were issued by the US congressional delegation.
Well, the congressional delegation emphasized that Trump's territorial ambitions are not shared by the American people. In fact, to give you a statement from Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski, she said that the majority of Americans do not support the idea of the US acquiring Greenland, and urged that Greenland should be viewed as an ally and not an asset. So there are also several other statements made by both Democrat and Republican senators and congressmen on this issue, and yeah, this is what's coming through at the moment on this. Kriti.
All right, Adarsh, thanks very much for sharing those updates with our viewers. And with that, we're now going to shift to cover some news from Egypt and Ethiopia. Viewers, the two nations are now once again embroiled in a conflict over the Nile, and US President Donald Trump has once again issued a statement to say that he might want to negotiate and mediate. Now, US President Donald Trump offered to mediate this dispute over Nile River water between these countries, and to quote Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, in fact, let's tell you that Trump had written him a letter. I'm ready to restart US mediation between Egypt and Ethiopia to responsibly resolve the question of the Nile water sharing once again. That was what Donald Trump wrote in letter to Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and that was also posted on his Truth Social account. That's on your screens as of now, viewers. Trump offered to mediate between Egypt and Ethiopia. Addis Ababa's September 9 inauguration of its grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has been a source of anger in Cairo, which is downstream on the Nile, and Ethiopia which is the continent's second most populous nation with more than 120 million people, is now seeing the $5 billion dam on a tributary of the Nile as central to its economic ambitions, which is what has sparked the conflict between these two nations. Egypt, however, says the dam violates international treaties and could cause both droughts and flooding. Ethiopia, however, has gone on to reject this claim. Trump, meanwhile, has praised Sisi in the past, including during an October trip to Egypt to sign a deal related to the Gaza conflict. And in public comments, Trump has echoed Cairo's concern about the water issues. Remember, viewers, in 2020, earlier, Trump had tried to mediate between these two nations, but those negotiations had failed. And now in his second term, as midterms approach, Trump once again has expressed his interest in mediation between Ethiopia and Egypt. And this is where I'd now like to invite my colleague Adarsh Tripathi to join us back. Adarsh, why is Trump interested once again now? What's in it for him?
Well,
Despite the fact that 2020 negotiations and mediation as he had wanted had failed, Trump is now re-entering this dialogue. Why do you think now?
Well, Kriti, there are several reasons that President Trump is interested in brokering a lasting agreement on the Nile water sharing issue between Ethiopia and Egypt. Well, Sudan as well, but Sudan has its own internal problems to grapple with for the moment, so it's not expected to be as active in these negotiations, in these talks. However, going into these reasons very briefly, first of all, there is the Nobel factor. Obviously, now recently we saw Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado hand over her Nobel Peace Prize to President Trump in what Trump called a very warm and very symbolic gesture, right? Trump has spent the large part of the past year lobbying for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's claimed several times that he solved wars all over the world, and he's staked his claim as, you know, the deal maker in chief, so to say. So this is point number one. Trump has touted himself as the world's ultimate deal maker, and securing a resolution to this high stakes water dispute would be seen as a crowning achievement in his foreign policy, particularly with regards to the Middle East. Secondly, an important factor to be noted here is Trump's relationship with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. This is another very important factor in Trump's push to influence the GERD negotiations. Now, the US president has previously called el-Sisi his favorite dictator, quote unquote, and he's also praised the leading role that el-Sisi took in the negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza. Of course, the key talks where the breakthrough was achieved in that case were held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and included among others Turkey's Erdogan and of course leaders from across the Middle East. But Trump has singled out el-Sisi for his role in these negotiations several times. So the equation between Trump and el-Sisi is an important one to consider when you talk about this issue at hand. Now, it's also important to note that President el-Sisi and Trump's personal equation, was actually what stood in the way of the last time President Trump tried to negotiate this particular issue. Ethiopia basically accused Trump of being too biased towards Egypt and el-Sisi to be able to broker a fair treaty, and that's why the talks fell apart in the first go. So it'll be very, very interesting to see how talks go about this time around. Moreover, there's a lot of history that has gone into the sharing of the water of the River Nile. Of course, as we all know, the River Nile is the single longest river in the world, and it flows through 11 countries in total. And countries like Egypt and like Ethiopia and like Sudan, which fall towards the latter end of the river, they rely upon this river. Like in the case of Egypt, Egypt relies upon the Nile for 97% of its irrigation, of its freshwater irrigation. So for Egypt, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is and has always been a matter of great concern. Now, these countries have not been able to sort their issues out in a peaceful manner. Trump has previously, in fact, he's also stated that Egypt might, in fact, blow up the Ethiopian dam if talks do not end favorably. So it will be very, very interesting to see what kind of outcomes come out of these negotiations this time around. Kriti.
Indeed, thanks very much, Adarsh, once again for sharing those updates with our viewers and filling us in with the latest that's coming in. And with that, viewers, we are now going to move on and track some news now, once again from the United States, where protests continue over the fatal shooting of Rennie Nicole Good in Minnesota at Minneapolis. And now in the latest, the U.S. Department of Justice has invoked a criminal investigation against Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Frey over alleged obstruction of the immigration and custom enforcement agents. Now, two prominent Minnesota Democrats are being investigated over alleged attempts to impede federal immigration operations. This in an escalation of Trump's administration's clash with the state's leaders. Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, they are facing a U.S. Justice Department inquiry over comments that were made by ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And this probe comes as a federal judge limited what tactics the ICE and other law enforcement officials could use in Minneapolis, blocking the use of pepper spray and arrests of peaceful protesters. Protests have ramped up in the city after Rennie Good was shot last week by an ICE agent. In fact, more details have also come to light after her death. Minneapolis, a woman was found by paramedics with at least 3 gunshot wounds and possibly a 4th to the head. Governor Walz, meanwhile, responded saying that weaponizing the justice system against your opponents is authoritarian tactic. That's the statement I'm quoting. And he said the only person not being investigated for the shooting of Rennie Good is the federal agent who shot her. In fact, Mayor Frey also said that he will not be intimidated and added that this is an obvious attempt to intimidate me for standing up for Minneapolis, our local law enforcement, and our residents against the chaos and danger this administration has brought to our streets. So obviously a clear state versus federal authority clash that's coming out from the United States, and clearly not the first such instance. I now request my colleague Adarsh Tripathi to join me back here. Adarsh, how do you see this conflict between state and federal authorities in the US right ahead of the midterms, and also what is apparently a Democrats versus Republican clash?
Well, it's very clearly a Democrat versus Republican clash, and to be very fair, President Trump seems to be targeting anybody who doesn't stand up to his standards of governance. What's also important to note, as you rightly said, Kriti, is that the midterm elections are coming up and they hold significant potential to change things in the United States, particularly with regards to the makeup of the two houses of government, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Well, while the Republican Party currently controls the majority in the Senate, through which it is effectively able to veto any moves taken against Trump initiated against Trump by the Democrats, this could very well change in the midterms. Now, speaking more about the actual investigation that's been launched into Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, these investigations have been launched by the Department of Justice, and they've been launched over an alleged conspiracy to impede federal immigration agents. Now, multiple news outlets have reported that The probe centers on statements made by these two leaders regarding the surge of immigration and enforcement and customs enforcement or ICE officials in the Minneapolis region, and this investigation marks yet another significant escalation. Now, we've seen similar such investigations being launched against people like Jerome Powell, but this is effectively the first time that an independent governor as well as the mayor of a major city are being investigated by the Federal Department of Justice at the behest of the President and the White House. So large-scale protests obviously have followed the shooting and have continued across Minneapolis and across the United States. And in the, as you've already stated, Governor Walz has issued a statement about this investigation. He's called it a pattern of weaponizing the justice system against political opponents. And he also pointed out that just days ago, Representative Elissa Slotkin and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell were among people targeted by similar investigations by the Department of Justice. Now, Walz has also highlighted that the one person, as you've already mentioned, but requires repeating, he's highlighted that the one person not being targeted by investigators in the case of Renee Good's murder were the cops who shot her. Now, Mayor Frey has also responded to these reports. He's called the investigation, as you rightly said, he's called it an attempt to intimidate him for standing up for his city. Frey has been very, very vocal in his opposition to ICE and in his opposition to President Trump. And he's clearly stated that this is the reason, this is the sole reason why this investigation has been opened into his actions and his words. His comments effectively reflected a deep frustration with what he views as an unwarranted federal crackdown on his city.
Sure. All right, Adarsh,
yeah.
I'd stop you there. We also have the statement of Governor Tim Walz. Let's show our viewers that.
Minnesotans have made it clear time and again they expect transparency through this process where a police officer uses deadly force. I don't have a predetermined notion. Yes, I saw the video. Yes, I saw that. But a thorough investigation will see what happened before that. It will take all factors in, and it will come up with a fair and just conclusion. And we will accept that. Very, very difficult for Minnesotans to think in any way this is going to be fair.
All right, viewers, with that, it's a wrap on this edition of the Newsroom. Thanks for watching NewsX World. As always, for your daily dose of international news and updates.